Norum, thanks for joining.
Pleasure, Sam. Thanks for having me.
So, Robert, a man of many hats, 30 plus years experience in the marketing game. My quick question to you, just like a little curveball, actually, I probably should have warned you about this before starting. What are you most excited about by the marketing landscape at the moment?
I think just constantly moving, constantly being challenged by it. Obviously, we have the joys of the global economy right now, and we also have the kind of double-headed sword of AI, which is both exciting new development and potential headache for quite a lot of people. So it's interesting just to constantly be challenged and to respond to the weather, if you like, that's unpredictable and deal with it.
And just a quick follow-on question from that, because I've been, the more and more I've dived into it in AI, and we'll cover it a lot when we get through to the questions, I've been going down rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and there just seems to be layer upon layer upon layer where you can just like keep optimizing like your life. How do you think overall the marketing landscape is keeping up? Because, well, for me personally, I feel like I don't know. I feel like marketers are typically, they lean into innovation a lot of the time, as opposed to most industries. But yeah, I don't know what you think, how you feel it's going.
Well, I think, as I say, people are scratching their heads a little bit. I think there's a constant, what can it do for me? And I think companies who are, diving in the deep end, to use my analogy, and adopting it and playing with it and experimenting are the companies that are going to do well. From my own point of view, I've subscribed to 3 or 4 different AI engines, for want of a better phrase, and I just experiment with them as and when I can. And I'm seeing agencies, obviously, who have resources and have some smart young tech heads or propeller heads or whatever, really getting into adopting it in a big way. So I'm excited by it. I think clearly there are some potential threats to, writers, people who do research, and of course, just jobs in general. But I still think that the truth of the matter is that it's not AI that will ever take your job. It's the people that understand AI and can do a great job with it that might take your job,
Yes. Wow. This has started very, very hot. But yes. Okay. We're going to cover more of this, I think, as we go through the questions.
Okay.
But just to give the viewers a quick overview, we've collected a bunch of challenges from the ABM Answered community. And for this session, we're predominantly going to lean into the basics, because fundamentally you need to do that to get ABM right in the at the start, if you're going to do well with it over the course of 12, 24 months. So challenge 1 that came in, Robert, was sales and marketing alignment. It's probably, I would argue, the biggest challenge that marketers face, because without it, you're pretty much dead in the water before you've even got going. But like, what are your best practices? What's your process for aligning with sales? How do you get them on board? And yeah, if you could be as tactile as possible, that I think would be really, really helpful.
Okay, well, I'm not sure about the tactile bit, but I'll try and do everything else I can. I think the most important thing with ABM is that people understand what it is. And the very first thing I talk about in my ABM Essentials training, which of course does spend a lot of time talking about sales and marketing alignment, is you need to define what ABM is going to be for your organization. If we could turn the clock back 21 years, if you can believe it, that's how long ABM has been around. I don't think marketeers would want account-based marketing as the 3-letter acronym, probably curse the day. And the implication, I think, so often is that ABM is something that's owned, run and delivered by marketing. And of course, that's absolutely not the case. You need sales, marketing, customer success, business development teams, even delivery teams, to really understand what ABM is. So I think the first step in engaging sales is to define exactly what it is, and then to engage them with how it can help them. So they need to understand that it's a strategic play. It's looking at your most important accounts and prospects. They need to understand what their role in proceeding is. They need to understand what marketing are actually going to do for them. And I think if you start with that platform, which does involve some training potentially, and it certainly involves some enthusiastic shouting from the rooftops of this thing called ABM, and it's going to really help you in your role and help you be more successful, if you like.
And what, this great response, what vehicle have you found is quite good at communicating that? Because I guess it really depends on the salesperson, but is it a case of visually putting a graph in front of them and being like, hey, if you help us get this ABM campaign off the ground, your commission check is going to go whoosh? Or like, is it just a case of constant touch bases, like once a week via email?
Well, I mean, I actually spend a lot of time presenting to salespeople and explaining to them what ABM is. So I think the first thing is create a great deck that explains what ABM is, have a bunch of data points in there that show how other companies are being really successful using it. And of course, if there's some big numbers there in terms of ROI or deals struck, then that's fantastic. Show them what the deliverables will be and excite them with the potential of, rather than just generic marketing, having marketing that's targeted at their accounts or at the industry sectors they specialize in. So that's the upfront piece. And then I think, to your point, the most successful ABM programs are obviously where sales and marketing are really working as a SWAT team. And on that basis, I think, you need either weekly stand-ups or a regular platform to be engaging of what you're doing, what's going well, what isn't. And I think it's almost the old thing of marketing need to market marketing. And you need to constantly be reminding the organization of what you're doing in ABM and the success that you're having. And start with the quick wins. We've identified 50 more people in this account that are not in the CRM and we've never spoken to before. Well, that's not actually a big challenge. Go off and do some research into the account and find insights that you didn't know about and share that with the sales team. That's a quick win. Start to create some really meaningful content and land it and look for engagement, particularly from people they didn't know or they weren't speaking to. That's a quick win. So I think sometimes people get hung up by how quickly can I show the ROI or when will I see the revenue? And of course, if you're on a long, complex deal cycle, that could take a long time. So you definitely have to celebrate everything you achieve as you achieve it.
A marketer's job never stops, does it? It's not just external, it's internal. I love the military analogy. SWAT, are they? Well, no, I was thinking of SWAT teams, no SWOT analysis. Anyway.
No, SWAT team is definitely the guys that parachute in and do some serious damage behind the lines, I think.
Well, I feel like that's what's needed sometimes. Challenge 2 is setting objectives. So how would you decide? Like, every company is obviously different depending on where they're at, but like, how do you decide what your ABM objectives are? And again, I like to frame this question from someone that's just starting ABM or someone listening, sorry. They are going to have often, unless they're very, very lucky, an uphill battle with leadership, teaching them the benefits of ABM. So like, what are some good metrics to optimize for in the beginning, especially?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned leadership there, Sam, because from my point of view, I said the first thing you have to do is define what ABM means for your organization. The second thing is you need to go and engage leadership and get them to buy into the whole concept before you start trying to roll it out. Because if you're trying to push water uphill, that's pretty tricky. If your leadership team have got it and they want it, then the chances of ABM, really being successful are obviously much higher. So I think you need to have the leadership team on board, and that would be, the head of revenue, the head of marketing, ideally the CEO, and if you can actually have it positioned in that way, you're in a good place. But in terms of setting yourselves up for success, I think, first of all, you need to think about ABM in terms of what role can it play in making the business more successful. And on that basis, you need to understand the makeup of your current business and where you make your money and which are the most profitable accounts, which are the most important verticals. And I'd suggest you probably even sit down with the FD, to say, and by the way, that's the CFO, the financial director, in case that's not immediately obvious. Where do we make our money? Which are the most important accounts? What does our ideal customer profile look like? And then you clearly want to think about, well, what are the needs of the business? If we're looking at our revenue targets for the next 12 to 24 months, what percentage of that is coming from existing customers that we want to upsell and cross-sell to? What percentage of it is coming from new accounts? That should then start to drive your behavior. And I think if you start from day one by actually embedding your ABM strategy in the needs of the business, then of course you're in a much stronger place. And if you've got sponsorship from leadership, then you're in a good place too. So in that context, I think, don't see ABM as an experiment. Don't see it as a pilot per se, even if you do have to start off by piloting the concept to show it working, but really make the decisions involving the key stakeholders. So choose your accounts carefully, choose the segments that you're focusing on carefully, and make sure they reflect the needs of the business. Then, of course, take that into the sales organization and get them excited by the potential, and then think about how you're going to roll out your communications, your messaging, etc.
Well, Robert, you're doing my job for me because you just touched upon it there. And the next question that came in actually is about target account selection. Yeah, you've got your objectives. How methodically would you, yes, I guess chronologically as well would be helpful. Like, what's your process for selecting your target accounts?
Well, again, if you think about starting with the total addressable market and then thinking about, well, what are the priorities of the business? It might be that you want to generate a constant pipeline of new opportunities for the organization. And it might be that that's going to dictate you need potentially hundreds of accounts in play at any one time. So that, of course, is going to demand a one-to-many approach. You're going to need to think about, your outbound marketing platforms, potentially using some of the tools out there that will give you access to intent. And that's typically going to be a digital play where you're bringing companies in at the top of the funnel and starting to nurture them over time. So that's going to drive one set of behavior in terms of the accounts you're looking at. You could, of course, go and talk to the leadership team or the sales team, and they say there are 10 mission critical accounts that we have to win in the next 12 months or protect and grow. And that will then result in a completely different approach. You're not thinking one-to-many there, you're thinking one-to-one, and you're going to take a really hyper-focused approach to each account. And you're going to be working really closely with your whole sales organization, or at least all of the people involved in those accounts. And just to kind of throw the mix in, we've covered one-to-many and one-to-one. It might also be that we say, actually, there are 5 key verticals. We've got a number of accounts in each vertical that we need to focus on that are existing customers, but we want to break into new accounts in those verticals as well. And that would drive a one-to-few behavior. So I always talk about, ABM is a methodology and you have the building blocks, but you still have to make some really intelligent choices about where you start and how you roll out ABM. You might start at the top of the pyramid with a handful of one-to-one accounts and then work out how you scale. Or you might start actually with the whole pyramid and talk about, we want a one-to-many program that will give us exposure, will build credibility, will build leads, if you like, for want of a better phrase, or at least opportunities. And clearly those sort of business drivers are going to result in a completely different approach to ABM.
You make a really good point there, because I've experienced it as well, where just ask leadership what accounts as well. Like I think, especially when I started running ABM, I would think it was all on me, or I had to figure out who we're going to go after, when actually ask sales, ask leadership, and you get 80% of the way there. And then I would use intent data. And I mean, I'm skeptical about intent data, but you can sprinkle it in to kind of solidify those decisions at the end. But great point.
Yeah.
Challenge 4 is account research. So again, you mentioned the 3 there: one-to-one, one-to-few, one-to-many. So I imagine it differs. But what does your account research process look like? What tools are essential for you? And I'll let you take the floor with that one.
Yeah. Well, I think to tick off the easiest one first, one-to-many, you're obviously not really doing in-depth research, particularly if you're looking at hundreds of accounts. And you're probably more likely to be doing an analysis of your CRM system to choose the right accounts, perhaps cluster them into groups of accounts with common needs, maybe sitting in the same industries. And you might have thermographic data on each of those accounts, but it's going to be relatively light touch. I think where research becomes critical, is at one-to-few, where you're looking at key industries, or of course, when you're looking at one-to-one on single accounts, or perhaps even supporting a bid or a pursuit or a deal. And in that context, for the last 7 or 8 years, I've worked with an offshore provider in India, and they do desk research for me. And they produce really in-depth, chunky studies, 60, 80, 100 slides, depending on what you're trying to achieve. And in a one-to-few context, that would be, let's understand the vertical. Let's assume it's, banks in North America or banks in Asia Pac. We need to understand what's going on in the financial services sector as a whole, and banking specifically. And it might even come down to retail banking or asset management or whatever the class is. So that's giving you a really strong perspective on an industry segment that you can then, of course, use for your strategy, value proposition, and messaging. If you're looking at 10 accounts in a one-to-few play, I think, it makes sense to be doing, if you like, relatively light touch profiles on each account. Because, of course, you need to understand who all the key stakeholders are right across the buying group. So that's a must have. And B, if you're going to personalize your one-to-few content in the last mile, then you need some sort of extra sizzle, if you like, or personalized stuff that you can layer in to your communications. When you're talking one-to-one, of course, this is in-depth, 360. We need to understand everything about the company's structure, strategy, people, their competitive landscape. If we're a tech firm, what's going on in the tech landscape? And most importantly, I think you need to net out with an opportunity analysis that says, based on everything we've found out about the account and everything we know we could offer, where should we be playing? So I'd say historically, that's been something that's been done manually. We've mentioned the AI, the letters early on in this call. That's clearly changing things, and more agencies I know are actually looking at agentic approaches to AI to actually help them with account research or sector research. And whilst I don't necessarily think that the AI solution is as robust at the moment as perhaps the analyst doing desk research, it's obviously accelerating the process and bringing the cost down. So again, I think you need to make some value judgments about what kind of research do we really need. And maybe it's a combination of analysts doing desk research and smart players who are taking an agentic AI approach to generating their own research.
Well, you already answered my follow-on question, so that's perfect. So I was going to say, how do they compare? Because a lot of ABM work gets sourced out to like India and Bangladesh as well. I've got contacts out there. But yeah, I was going to ask you about that on how. So because the ChatGPT deep research reports are insane. But yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother webinar for another day, isn't it?
Well, it possibly is. I mean, I still think that even the agencies I know who are doing agentic research reckon it's down to the quality of the brief and having a human to actually road test it, because you can still get curveballs coming out of AI. As everybody knows, generative AI can still feed you false information that is beautifully presented and sounds great. But if it's wrong and you put that in front of, your sales team, or even worse, you put it in front of a customer, then the wheels could come off quite quickly.
Oh, you're sorry, I was on mute there. Yeah. So that's really fascinating, because I don't mind using AI internally and for the research piece. I think it's a great application, great use case. But what I get a real bee in my bonnet about, and like I built my career basically on outreach emails, like personalization, and then we've got Clay now, which is great. But it's like people that just want full automation, which almost kind of takes the sentiment of ABM away from you, like that human kind of touch. Anyway, we must persevere, Robert. I'm so sorry. Challenge 5 was engagement channels. So this came in from Janelle Amos.
Okay.
And she asked, when it comes to engagement strategies, again, we should probably provide some context here. If you want to use a specific company, that's fine, because it's going to vary from what the company is. But in terms of like engagement strategies, what top 3 challenges would you prioritize and why?
When you mean challenges, are you thinking channels or
channels? Sorry, yeah, I got okay. Reading off the sheet.
Yeah, I mean, I did obviously read this one, and I was thinking, well, how many channels actually are there? I mean, I think in any ABM program, you're likely to be using email as a channel, because you just can't get away from the fact that that's the most direct way of communicating directly with decision makers. You're likely to be doing some targeted digital advertising. And of course, that could be LinkedIn, or it could be using 6 Sense and demand-based to serve up to a much wider set of media. You could be using Google. You could be obviously working with your digital marketing agency to say, I need to land some smart comms in front of these people. But interestingly, I thought, well, maybe just to be a bit old school, if you're thinking of a channel, I think if you're looking at one-to-one ABM, you might well be thinking about smart and really well-produced direct marketing, direct mail, the physical items. And I'm a big fan of that because, I think there's so much noise in digital channels. And there's so much noise on social. LinkedIn is obviously inundated with companies trying to reach out to prospects and customers. Email, we all know that you're lucky if you're going to get a 20% open rate. The click-through rate's going to be much lower than that, and that's performing quite well. I think if you were targeting the top 10 decision makers at Barclays Bank, what Citibank or at Standard Chartered to cover off all 3 regions, the likelihood of those people opening emails or responding or even engaging with anything on LinkedIn is pretty minimal. So if you had a hand-delivered package with a beautifully produced booklet, magazine, communication, video, first of all, it's likely to get to them. And secondly, they may well read it or watch it. So I think if you're going to be successful in ABM, you absolutely need to have a multi-channel approach. Mm-hmm. You obviously need to test and learn. And I think, different companies will respond in different ways. And of course, the demographics of the people you're targeting is going to change massively. If you're talking to Gen Z, Gen X, who of course everyone's now saying are actually the new B2B buyers, or at least becoming the new B2B buyers.
Scary.
And that's one set of behavior. If you're targeting, I won't be derogatory about particular age groups, particularly, as you can tell, I'm not super young, but if you're thinking about senior execs, maybe in their 50s, let's say, then of course they're going to have a completely different mindset. So you really need to think about, well, what's the right engagement strategy, not just within an account, but even within the stakeholders that you're trying to reach based around their profile, their behavior, et cetera, et cetera.
Robert, you nailed it. I'm so glad you mentioned direct mail as well, because I've been lucky enough to interview a lot of people doing this, and I've heard some crazy things that have been sent. Have you got any crazy or out there gifts that you've sent, or anything that has worked, before I kind of throw some random ones into the mix?
Yeah, I mean, one of the case studies I use in my training, and with the permission I hasten to add of the decision makers involved, is Henkel, who are actually a traditional adhesives manufacturer, but they were targeting the datacom and telecom sector, and their adhesives are used on motherboards and all kinds of stuff. And when they were targeting, I won't name the company, but they're kind of top of the food chain, really large customer they wanted to grow. They were sending boxes with NFTs in, boxes with motherboards set in sort of virtual ice cubes. I mean, of course, they weren't real ice cubes, but they looked like ice cubes. And these boxes were really pretty chunky, So that, I think, is an example. More recently, and this was actually presented publicly, so I can probably even talk about it, but one of the agencies I work for a client called Immuta, who are in the security space. And they were targeting Volvo. And not only did they create some fantastic materials, but they actually delivered these materials in bags that looked like car airbags.
Very smart.
Really nice packaging.
Yeah.
And they came up with this metaphor of Volvo invented the seatbelt originally. And so they had the physical seatbelt and the digital seatbelt actually coming together in a visual, that they then created a physical version of that wrapped around their manifesto that they had hand delivered, obviously, into these key decision makers. So, I mean, the more you look, I think the more you find people doing really interesting things with direct mail. I think, the key is not to be suckered into thinking that ABM equals digital, because it really doesn't. ABM is about how do you target your most important accounts and prospects in a way that will differentiate you, will engage the customer, and will give you the best possible chance of success. And, then it's about being as creative as you can be.
That's awesome. And I think those gifts, the ones that actually try and be contextually relevant, are obviously the most powerful. Sometimes it's difficult for B2B companies. There's a lot of cyber companies, there's a lot of money flying around there, but to find gifts that are relevant. Anyway, another rabbit hole. I could run 6 sessions with you, couldn't I, Robert, if I was lucky enough? Anyway, we are
anytime you like, Sam, so feel free.
We are nearly there. But I will take you up on that probably at some point. Question 6 came in from Kelly Shermahon, Pegasystems. She asked, can you share a detailed success story, including the challenges and how they were overcome?
Yeah, I saw this one, and unfortunately, as a independent consultant, it's a bit tricky because I don't actually typically see programs right through to the comms and the delivery. So I would say, if I explain what I do and the success that I see from that, most companies that I work with, and I've got several in play right now, are companies that are starting out with ABM and don't necessarily really get it. Maybe there's a few evangelists or a few early adopters, but on the whole, even large tech firms are still trying to work out how to do ABM. So on that basis, what do you need to do? Well, the first thing you need to do is to define what ABM means for your organization, as I said earlier. You might not even call it ABM. Some people are calling it ABE, account-based engagement, or ABX, account-based experience. Choose how you're going to brand it and position it to the company. Then you move on to engaging the senior management team, and that is about internal presentations and really selling them on the upside and the benefits of ABM. And once you've got that in place, you need to engage the sales organization. So all three of those things are actually pretty important to get right. Then you need to think about, well, what would our ABM strategy look like? And as I said before, that might involve going off and interviewing the CFO to find out, well, where do we make our money? Where are our most profitable accounts? What does our ideal customer profile really look like? And that's going to drive a set of behavior. You need to talk to the chief revenue officer to work out where are your priorities this year, whether that's existing customer growth or breaking into new accounts. And of course, that's going to vary wildly. You even need to think about things of, well, what's the annual contract value, or what's the lifetime value of the customer? And therefore, how much can we really spend in terms of trying to win this account or grow it? So all of those things are mission critical. And I spend quite a lot of time with companies under the hood, if you like, or under the bonnet, if you're sitting in the UK, working out, well, what is the answer? What does this look like? Then you need to get into choosing your accounts. And we sort of touched on that earlier, but, I have a scorecard, which I try and personalize for each company, particularly if you're looking at one-to-one and one-to-few, of what are the key questions. We need to look at the size of the opportunity, the achievability of winning this account, the internal alignment with our core resources, and particularly sales and marketing. Mm-hmm. All of this before you've even started, So now we've got our strategy, we've chosen our accounts, we've got leadership on board, we've got sales on board. Now let's think about going live. And of course, you're not necessarily going to turn everything into ABM on day one. So maybe you say, well, we're going to start with 3 one-to-one pilots, a one-to-few pilot, and we're going to have a couple of hundred accounts in a one-to-many play. Then you need to think about, well, what's the approach from there? And for both one-to-one and one-to-few, I have a 6-stage process I take companies through. Let's get the internal alignment with a kickoff session. Where are we? Where are we going? What do we need to know? Then the research, then the strategy, then the value proposition and messaging. And at that point is normally where I hand off to an agency or maybe an internal team occasionally. And they go, oh, fantastic. You've done all this groundwork. Everybody's on board. Everybody's aligned. You've chosen your accounts. You've got your value proposition and messaging. We'll take it from here, And of course, I know lots of agencies that do that stuff. And sometimes I partner with them. Sometimes they partner with me. Sometimes I just hand off and it's over to them to take it forward.
Robert, I feel like you're getting the short end of the stick here. You're running through all the brick walls and pushing that boulder up the hill, and then just as it's at the top, it's like cycling up a hill. You don't get to get the fun of going down.
It is a bit frustrating because sometimes I'll do all the heavy lifting for the first 90 days, maybe 120 days, and then at that point somebody else goes, thanks, and they might then have the account for the next 2 years, So it does mean that I guess I add the most value when people are starting out. Of course, some people want me to stay in the loop and come back on quarterly reviews or touch points. And even some of the agencies I work with, keep me in the loop as well. So it's not to say that I'm a sorry figure that does all the hard work and then never sees any return.
Yeah, we won't pay. Or when they're struggling and have some problems, they come back to you as the saver. You're like the Batman for ABM. I quite like it. Yeah, Rob, are you okay?
That before, but,
well, you can whack it in your LinkedIn bio now.
Okay, yes. Sam Hall says, I'm the Batman of ABM. Yeah.
In fact, I would not do that. That's highly not recommended. Robert, are you okay for 5 more minutes? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
Nearly there. Question 7 came in from Chris Rack. So also great guy, founding Mockingbird, which uses voice AI for ABM. It's very interesting. We had a really great session and he asked, is the MQL dying or is it still relevant and why?
Well, I don't know if you've seen Kerry Cunningham speak from Sixth Sense, but he's been talking about the death of the MQL for at least 2 years. And I think to varying degrees, demand-based are probably in that space now as well. I would say the MQL as a meaningful, what's the right word, metric, probably should be dead. But I still think, there's a lingering hope for it. And the rationale for that is this. When you start doing marketing, you're obviously looking to, and particularly if you're doing ABM properly, you're looking to identify, the key decision makers, influencers. What does the buying group look like? But inevitably, somebody is going to engage with you first, right, of that buying group. And if that's one person in the buying group, then that, in a sense, is a lead. We could call it an opportunity. We could call it the beginning of a dialogue. We can be obtuse and try and avoid calling it a lead, but it is basically a lead. So in that sense, you could say they're from a target account, they have the right profile, they've engaged with our content. That is an MQL. Now, you could decide that on day one, or you could say, oh no, they only become an MQL when they've engaged with 3 pieces of our content, and they've scored 50 plus. But that's sort of semantics. You can decide at what point they become an MQL. The real question is, how useful is an MQL? And this is the stuff that Kerry talks about a lot, which is actually a single lead within an account doesn't really signify anything. What you really want, of course, is multiple touch points with multiple decision makers in something that would become an MQA, which is a marketing qualified account. And particularly if you're looking at one-to-one and one-to-few, it's all about building out your brand credibility, your engagement, and of course, really starting to bring those people to the table, whether that's conversations, dialogue, meetings, opportunities, etc. So I would say the MQL isn't like particularly important, but it is the starting point. We've got at least one piece of engagement with this key account that we know is really important to us. The most important thing then is, how do we circle back to that account and start finding everybody around that individual and their buying group, as opposed to just hammering them constantly because they're an MQL, therefore, we've got to just keep hitting them until they buy something. Because they're not going to buy something by themselves. As we know, most B2B decisions, most tech decisions, minimum of 10 influencers or people involved in the buying decision. Some research is saying up to 17. So buying groups are not trivial, particularly if you're looking at an enterprise play.
Okay, so this is interesting. Chris leans towards that it is relevant, and I can't actually remember what his argument was. And I'm not trying to mediate here, and not because I don't want to pick sides, but everything you said is really, really interesting, and I quite like the MQA. I've never heard that before, but obviously that's a great phrase. I think I probably lean towards the MQL is dying if you're doing ABM, because like you said, ABM often involves multiple decisions makers, but if you are selling a much smaller SaaS solution and the buying committee might be 2, it might be, hey, the head of marketing needs to convince the CFO or something, then obviously an MQL would be relevant, but because that's targeting 50% of the buying committee. So God, you're getting so granular. Ultimately, it doesn't really change anything, I guess, but it's an interesting discussion to have, because it's the language you use to communicate internally of how well things are going.
Exactly. And I mean, I think there is a big difference, by the way, if you're doing ABM to an enterprise play compared to mid-market or even SME. I don't typically play in the SME space at all. And I think, the usefulness of ABM in the SME space becomes more questionable. If you're at the top end and you have a high value, complex sales cycle, running into hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions, then ABM, frankly, is almost a no-brainer. As you come down the food chain, the smaller your deal size and the simpler the purchase process, I'd say the less critical ABM is. And you're probably more likely to be using one-to-many ABM, which in a way is almost like
is it even ABM?
Well, there's a question. I mean, I actually have been starting to talk about, I've been saying it for quite a while, but I talk about one-to-many ABM being the new demand gen. And the theory bit behind that is you pre-qualify the accounts you want to go after with sales. You go after them using a one-to-many ABM approach, whether that's 50, 100, 200, 300 accounts. It's not tens of thousands. And then when you have an opportunity, and let's call it an MQL if you like, for the sake of paying lip service to that question, there's no question about that being a relevant lead, because it's actually been pre-qualified. That is a real individual that we've targeted in an account we've agreed we're going after. So the only question now is, at what point do we hand that to an SDR or a BDR to qualify? And at what point does that ever hit a salesperson? And I think the real danger with MQLs in an enterprise environment is the theory is, oh, it's an MQL, therefore we give it to sales and hopefully it becomes an SQL. Well, if it's just a single touch point from a single individual that's opened a couple of emails and downloaded a piece of content, is that the right time to be handing that to a salesperson? No. So I think MQLs can be very misleading. If marketing look at an MQL and go, we've got an early warning here, this account might be interested in us. Let's look at all the other people in that account that we could circle back to. And let's see if we can take it from one person, the MQL, through to 5 or 10 people who are all starting to engage with our content, the MQA. Now we can go to sales and go, these guys are all over our content. They are definitely interested, whether it's an SDR going to qualify it or whether it's the salesperson going, I'm hungry, I want to go and talk to these people,
Mm-hmm.
But definitely going back to your point about SMEs, if there are only 2 people in the buying group, it becomes a little bit more questionable. You're certainly not going to be doing one-to-one ABM, and you probably wouldn't be doing one-to-few ABM to them.
For sure. I mean, when I first started this, I didn't even realize there was a difference between demand gen and one-to-many ABM, like just putting random bits of content out there. And because ABM is ultimately just good marketing, right? And I think with the advancements in technology, there is literally no excuse not to do one-to-many ABM for all of the accounts that fall in that third tier. Robert, I'm really terribly sorry. We don't normally overrun like this, but I'm going to put it down to having a really good conversation with you.
You'll be pleased to know I hadn't booked a call directly after you, Sam, so I'm not sitting here sweating about my next call waiting for me.
Well, I appreciate it. So the last 2 things I'm going to ask you, just for fun. So we build a lot of tech at ABM Answered. So if you could invent a tool or technology, what would it be and why? So it's for our curiosity, I guess.
Well, first of all, I'm not a techie, so you may get smarter answers from people that are immersed in MarTech. I guess for a long time, the thing I've been talking about is it would be a perfect scenario if you could pull everything together into a single view. At the moment, if you think about it, you've got players with intent, you've got players serving up ads, you've got your CRM system, very often you've got your outbound marketing platform. There's so many different pieces of tech, and some of them talk to each other and some of them don't. So I think the perfect scenario would be either a one-stop shop that actually enabled you to do your entire ABM program in a single platform, or if that is really smoking the curtains, then could you create at least something that becomes a really smart dashboard that will plug into everything and pull out the relevant data and give you great reporting? Because, again, we talked about the challenges of ABM. One of the challenges is the reporting and showing the value. If you're in a 12-month sales cycle, how do you demonstrate value all the way through that food chain? And that's not always the easiest of things for marketeers to do.
Great answer. I had a really interesting chat with my co-founder, Charlie, and some of our customer advisory board 2 weeks ago about something similar. And we came to the conclusion of questioning, do we even need dashboards? Because with why can't I just email the server and it pulls, but like what you're saying, everything relevant. So I think, is it Rollworks? I can't remember. I saw another platform a few weeks before that. And then you've got all the different CRMs and it's like, you're learning. And then it's like, I've got to config HubSpot. I did one of these sessions with Walter, and he blew my mind. I can't use HubSpot like he can, and all the stuff, and it was super smart. But I'm like, there's dashboards everywhere. You are so right. But why can't we eradicate dashboards and just ask it something and it gives me what I need to know? But then it's the execution. Anyway, I'm going down a rabbit hole now. It's how do you actually get all of it to work and see?
Yeah, and if I was guessing, I would say at some point, generative AI is going to enable that. Because to your exact point, if you had a platform, Gen AI, whatever the platform's called, and you said, go and interrogate all of these different sources and bring me back this report and visualize it and show me marketing engagement, sales engagement, revenue potential, at some point that might exist.
Yeah.
And that would be, for me, that would be nirvana, I think, for most people in, trying to run ABM programs.
For sure. It's not even like, it's like the reporting, the tracking, the setting up the reporting and tracking. It's just like hours and hours wasted. Anyway, final question, Robert. You have been amazing. Thank you so much for joining and answering other people's questions and mine. Do you have a question for our next guest?
Well, I did scratch my head long and hard about this one, and maybe this is putting people on the spot, but I would say, what's the optimal split between ABM into existing customers versus new name, new accounts? And if I'm allowed to have a part two, once you've answered that one, what's the optimal split between one-to-one, one-to-few, and one-to-many based around your own personal experience?
They're great. We've done like 72 interviews and no one's even angled a question like that. So I'm very excited to pose that to them. Robert, thank you so much for joining.
Pleasure. And of course, don't forget to hit me up for your trip to Spain at some point.
I will.